Welcome back to the AMA. Hoping everyone has been having a good time and learning through and being able to ask questions. We wanted to get a break from the panels and also utilize the time to ask Nishant any questions. So we circulated a Slido. I'm sure the team will re-add it here as well. We already have a lot of questions there, so I'm going to ask Nishant straight away. Nishant, are you good?
Yes.
Perfect. Cool. So a bunch of questions. Let me see. There's one question on how can we move from privacy compliance to privacy as a service?
It's a great question. I think that's a bit of a theme today in multiple conversations I'm having. So appreciate that question out of the back. I think when you look at privacy as a compliance mechanism, you can do several things. You can have a proper checkbox list of things to do. You can check for areas where the company is especially vulnerable or check for an upcoming law. But I think at some point you want to transition from building purely for compliance to building for trust and efficiency. So I would say, just as an example, when you demonstrate that data can be deleted in a timely fashion from a compliance perspective, you may build that capability for a specific control or a specific data set. You can basically say if the actual capability works, that is, you can delete data here, why not apply the deletion API to multiple data stores that contain other than just PIs, data stores that contain queries for ML, data stores that contain data that is used for remarketing, etc. So how do you apply those controls to multi-access and how do you bring more data stores in scope? So what that means is you will delete useless data from, or you will delete useless data from the warehouse, you'll delete useless data from Redis, etc. What that will mean is you shrink the overall data state, which means less cost from cloud provider storage perspectives, less cost to encrypt the data, and you are essentially applying controls more rigorously across the business, which will protect more across the business, make that tool work more efficiently, give you more visibility across the business. So you can start with compliance and build for trust, or you can build for trust and then repurpose that for compliance. The goal is to reuse tools wherever possible because privacy and efficiency go hand in hand. That's the message here. So compliance is the starting point, not the ending point.
Yeah, and I mean, like it's also as we've been talking all through the day, and I'm sure some of these conversations or the existing panelists might have answered it. It's like once you have that mindset shift, or I think was Jim who said, once you set the intent right, the right capability gets built. It's kind of like that. So thanks for answering that, Nishant. There's another pretty relevant question around generative AI. So the question is, how would you implement privacy engineering or privacy 2.0 into a customer facing generative AI model, such as translation chatbots or any other chatbots for customer support or customer service?
I think generative AI presents a huge opportunity and a challenge for privacy because a lot of the controls that privacy have gone from building purely for compliance to shifting left and efficiency purposes, right? From a Gen AI perspective, you have to worry about data insertion, hallucination, those sort of areas. You also have to worry about the wrong data being used for the foundational model and then that model influencing 50 other models behind the scenes, right? So from a Gen AI perspective, I would say if I wanted to road test how a privacy tooling actually works, I would actually use that privacy tool to check for corruption, obfuscation, hallucination, the Gen AI model and the data set, which means you can build the core model correctly. So before Gen AI came about, my model, my mantra to the industry was, why not shift left and apply those controls at scale across the stack, across the landscape, right? From a Gen AI perspective, why not apply those to foundational models? Because remember, it's that foundational model that leads to a whole bunch of analysis and capability, right? So what happens, why my concern with Gen AI is people are going to try and fix for privacy by looking at data. And that is great if you're dealing with purely privacy problem. But when it comes to Gen AI, you're looking at models, the business goals driving the models, right? So applying privacy controls to those will get you two wins. First is you'll understand what the Gen AI risk is, much more than before. And second, you'll understand how limited your privacy models are and where you can apply those controls more efficiently and improve the controls themselves. And that's the big lesson here, which is rather than the controls being the be all end all, why not use the controls to improve Gen AI models? And why not use those models to improve the privacy controls? It's a mutually reinforcing process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like the better privacy, again, like going back to the point, right? The better privacy controls practices you end up getting, the faster you can iterate and launch these models. Even if you're not launching model, even if you are just fine tuning it and using it in your products, the better your in-house is because of better privacy practices. You have a good data, you have less data to worry about. Less, again, you will have to look for biased data, you have enriched data. So and that improves the Gen AI part. And as you push the Gen AI thing, hopefully you get even better quality data So then the privacy gets enhanced. And so that makes a lot of sense, Nishant. Thanks for answering. Okay, that this one is pretty interesting. So it's like traditional assessments, or so it's basically saying probably the privacy assessments or some format of it. They don't identify emerging technology risks like data poisoning, hallucination, prompt DDoS or prompt DDoS, and last but not the least, re-identifying PII. So it's not kind of a question, but it's probably like hinting towards, I mean, how do privacy professionals or leaders, when the assessment they're doing don't identify these risks, how do they do that? How do they do a better job?
I think traditional privacy reviews were set up for one thing, which is to de-risk the business, to demonstrate that the attorneys looked at it, right? But I don't think there is any attorney on the planet, and I know a lot of smart attorneys myself. I don't think there is a single attorney on the planet that can check for these things, especially when it comes to re-identification, as an example, right? Remember, re-identification is not just about one data set; it's about this data set, this other separate data set, but a joining table in the middle. So you have table A, table B, and table C that joins the two together. And until day n, all you're doing is looking at table A or table B. But then on day n plus one, some smart engineer will come and link table A and table B, not knowing that they're not supposed to be linked because there are no controls, right? So when it comes to reviews of the privacy perspective, we've pushed a model called privacy consulting, where the privacy reviews happen at the tail end of the process by the attorneys, but privacy consulting happens at the beginning of the process, where people like me and Vaibhav help engineers, designers, business PMs, etc., to build things correctly from the get-go. And what you will learn is, you learn what the risks the business is taking. The business will learn the privacy risks that they're incurring for no reason, and you can guide them in the beginning to do the right thing, and then use that example to build more controls. Remember, this is about identify risk, build control, or order the control and see what the risk is not being identified. So whether it's perturbation, hallucination, etc., at the end of the day, we're talking about a gap between what is okay and what is not okay. So everything else is fancy terminology, whether it's Gen AI, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's data centers, whether it's identification. You're talking about the difference between what is okay and what's not okay. And the key is going to be rely upon the privacy review at the end of the process to check for the really big known risks and how they all fixed, right? But the goal behind privacy consulting at the front end is, how do you identify these risks and build technical controls for them and then apply those controls across the board? This is not a one and done deal. And that's the big thing here. The privacy review was designed to be a once and done deal. Privacy consulting is a perennial exercise to make the company more efficient and more privacy sensitive.
Yeah, and that's a lot of sense, right? Because the a lot of design decisions typically get made by the time it reaches. So, and the more friendlier it is for engineers to consult with you, then you can add value, right? And then you can find risk which you might not found are not finding in your regular price assessment as well.
Exactly.
So yeah, this another interesting question. I think it's linked to that. So maybe you can add to it, which is assessments are just a broken solution, just more break, fix, and not performing real privacy by design. How do we solve that problem? Probably a little harsh on that side. I mean, of course, like assessments are important and they do solve some problems. They don't solve all problems. And Nishant, you've seen that probably in other companies. So how would you answer that?
Remember, the assessors, whether it's third party auditors outside the company or internal audit inside the company, they are not the enemy. Sometimes they think they were the enemy and we think they're the enemy. But I would rather get the bad news from assessors beforehand than get caught up in a breach or a law break or something. Right? That's number one. But the second thing I would say is, these assessors are also learning like the rest of us. These assessors take existing frameworks and try to apply those frameworks to something that the framework was not built to apply for. So my message is, I agree with Vaibhav. The question is a bit harsh, but I also recognize the frustration because the question is probably coming from somebody who prepared a whole ton for the assessment and didn't really feel that the assessment added value. So the goal again would be, do your own homework first, educate the assessors, bring the assessors into the conversation at the consulting stage early on in the pipeline, and connect the assessment regime to the innovation regime. Make sure that the innovators, the engineers, the PMs, the ML specialists, etc., understand what the assessment is testing for. For example, if the assessor is testing for you using incomplete data, you probably don't want the ML using incomplete data either, right? So the assessors and the innovators are in the same team. They just speak a different language. It's like a rally where the assessors are holding the baton at the end, but the innovators are the ones holding the baton in the beginning. But we are all running the same race. So the solution here is, educate the assessors. And what I said earlier, which is, rather than having compliance dictate the innovation, You are having the innovators influence the compliance regime as well, right? So teach
Yeah.
the assessors what you're testing for, but also listen to the assessors and see what needs to happen differently, because they have a perspective as well. So don't shut the assessors down because you don't like the assessment. So build that relationship, influence the assessment regime, and learn from the assessment regime what you could be doing better as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And also, like, basically, I think one thing that I've seen talking to like other privacy leaders that people have been thinking about and are actively working towards is one, what are the outcomes of these assessments, right? And if the outcomes are something that really help engineering teams, they actually appreciate, even if it's via an assessment, doesn't matter how it is, right? So if the outcome is a risk that needs treatment and it's going to take a lot of time, sometimes, it's complex and you need to do that level of risk management. But sometimes if it's just like, okay, we are launching a new service and we're going to replicate a database, and then that's how it's going to be connected to the service. And that's how we're going to build this feature. And your recommendation helps them make a better decision on not to replicate, but to wait, 3 more seconds. That's a very actionable thing that improved product, reduce data cost because there's less deduplication, right? Or, if someone decides to add a new user form, and rather than making them wait for a full assessment, you straight away they get a guidance on adding your standard privacy notice, integrating into a CMP API that you already have bought or built. That's something that the engineers will really appreciate. So then the assessments you have, which are needed, are become also higher quality because people respond more because they know the outcome. The outcome of the assessment is something which is going to help. Either because you have reduced assessment, because automated some of the checks to a technology like ours, code scan, or even if not, then the focus is not to open risk, but to close the risk. Close the loop. That's been a pattern I've been hearing as well. So
Yeah. And just as an example, Vaibhav, if the assessment says check for proper compliance when it comes to consent, that means the engineers should look at that literally and say, what does consent actually mean? It means the pop-up, it means a copy, it means a translation, the right version of the disclosures, the right CMS to have the disclosure stored in version control, etc., etc. So I think it's important for the assessors and the engineers to have that connection, because when you go from 0 to 1, there's a lot of 0.1, 0.02 in the middle, right? You don't go from 0 to 1 directly. So it's important that both sides understand each other. The real reason why I harp on this partnership is because there is no law that is going to be prescriptive enough. At the end of the day, it's like immigration law. When you apply to be a US citizen, the government tells you you are responsible for understanding the law, even though the law was passed 40 years ago by people who don't understand the immigration system even now, right? So it's critical for the engineers and the assessors to understand that they can de-risk the business together rather than waiting for some external law. So don't look at this relationship as an adverse. It's hard in this situation. I get it. I've been in the PM situation. I think I'm ready to go. Products going to ship, great engagement waiting to happen. But then the assessor says, sorry, can't ship. And I get that tension. But the work to fix that happen before the assessment begins and after the assessment ends, not just during the assessment itself.
makes sense. Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for that, man. There's a slightly different on privacy engineering. I think, something that we've been touching on our regular webinars as well. So, I mean, even beyond Bridge, you can definitely go back and look at some of our webinar resources where we have deep dive into privacy engineering a lot more. But the question, Nishant, is privacy engineering is an area explored by big techs and data-driven companies. Are other companies such as CPGs, retailers, automotive companies exploring this new field as well?
They're exploring it, but rather quietly. They explore it when they talk to me off the record on Chatham House rules. Because when you explore this in public, you are concerned that you're broadcasting the fact that you haven't invested in this before. So a lot of people are wanting to do the right thing, but they're afraid of starting out. It's a bit like, these are people like the kids, like my nieces and nephews, they drive the bike in the backyard with the training wheels on. And they're so afraid of getting on the street that they stay in the backyard. Well, bikes were not built to be ridden inside the house. You want to ride outside the house, right? Like a ship is safe in the harbor, but the ship was not built to stay in the harbor. My Everybody's exploring it, but they don't know where to start. So my recommendation is, when you find the obnoxious engineers who are always asking questions as to why do we do it this way or not that way, what are we considered XYZ? So the people who think about stuff beyond the obvious are acting like privacy engineers. So there could be a security engineer, a compliance specialist, and you could have a lot of experience in privacy, but not on the engineering side, and vice versa. So a lot of companies are exploring it, and that is why we are setting up Privado code scanning solution, a consulting regimen to help build that talent. Because the good news is that the people are trying to do the right thing and trying to de-risk the business with automation. They just don't know where to start or who to ask and how to take the next step and formalize it. So you are at the gate with the training wheels off, and we're ready to hold the bike behind the scenes to prevent you from falling. But the eventual goal is for you to ride the bike very fast, enjoy the breeze and the sunrise and the sunset, right? So that's the quick answer to that question.
Yeah, and I also kind of really love the idea, and also as been speaking with other privacy leaders is kind of internal training, right? I mean, of course the market has changed, everyone is looking at their own skills as well. So there is a lot of right talent inside engineering orgs, inside I would say architecture teams, security engineering teams who are interested in privacy, want to learn and basically can become privacy engineers for you pretty fast because they know a lot about the company. They know different teams. They already have relationships. And as they learn about privacy, they can supplement your team really, really fast, right? So that's also a path that I've seen some companies now take and has been pretty successful as well. So yeah, something to think about. Even if, a company doesn't have a formal privacy engineering program, there are these avenues that can be explored, cross-functional. So that's something to think about. I think we have some data or also on growth of privacy engineering. I don't exactly remember the percentage, but it's been growing year on year on a very high percentage. So I would be surprised if, the automotive companies, retailers, CPGs don't have privacy engineers. I mean, if they don't have, they'll have it pretty soon, is what my guess
And there are people probably doing the job right now without the title. Like that's how my
is.
career.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody who's looking at data holistically, the platform holistically, the interaction of data and services across the board, if you're doing that, you are beginning your privacy engineer career as we speak.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's another point on detecting PII sensitive data earlier in its life cycle. As an idea, it sounds pretty shant, but there are so many software application that needs to be pre-engineered. So there's less of a question, more of a comment. Yeah, probably I can give it a go, and then Nishant, I'll hand it over to
Sure.
you for your answers as well. So yeah, I mean, like, I think like a lot of my learning on this has been also how companies would have tried to do automated data discovery. And again, I think Nishant, probably you're the best person to talk about that. Is like depending on where you point in the cycle, your data discovery solution, the process could look more or less painful. The cost could look high or low. So I think that's a conscious decision that you might have to take. The good thing is like if you move really left on the application layer, ideally you don't need to you might need to re-engineer them if they have privacy issues, but to get visibility you don't need to re-engineer them. The idea is the code is the logic on how data moves, so it should tell you the story on this is what your data is, and you don't need to re-engineer to get the visibility. Of course, to fix the issues you need to re-engineer, right? So once you know there's a problem, you need to fix it, but to get visibility you don't need to re-engineer. But Nishant, I mean, this has been a theme in your book as well. Would love to kind of see, like, from a journey perspective, how should companies think about where to tag? What does early really mean?
I think I would say there are only two things that live forever: government programs and services at tech companies. And I think using privacy code scanning tools or privacy consulting as a way to understand that is pretty critical. There are three things you need to watch for: services that are working as intended and are should not be blocked. That's pretty critical. But then there are services that have been repurposed so often that the original purpose and test and control are no longer enough. So deleting a service is kind of a pretty significant step. It takes a long time. There's a lot of dependencies. The question you could ask yourself is, how do you get to a situation where a service was built to use this data for this purpose, and now it uses that data for that purpose? So service management is critical. This is where privacy engineering is important because you are testing not just for the risk to the business, but you're testing deviation from initially stated goals. And anytime that happens, mapping services to data to use cases is pretty critical. And that is what privacy engineering is about. Third thing you want to watch for is, are there services that are doing stuff that was never permitted to begin with? This was an example of a service that was spun up by an engineer who got promoted because of the service. But as a result, the service took off in a big way. I've had that happen before. You build something for a very small use case, people know it exists, and they repurpose it for other purposes, right? That service was never ordered initially. So how do you map the initial use case, the capability, and the data, and keep that mapping continuously? Right? As an example, you eat breakfast at 8 in the morning, lunch at 11:30, dinner at 6 p.m., right? And if your time zone changes, you still try to keep to those times, right? So how do you make sure that regardless of the changes that took place in the business and the economy, how do you make sure that mapping remains unchanged? If that mapping needs to change, you should do it knowingly rather than just doing it in the background and hoping nobody notices, right? So if you as a privacy expert go and tell your business, delete these services, You will lose more battles than you win
Yeah.
because nobody wants to delete the service. The key is catching that in the initial stage when the service expands its scope or the data expands its scope. Catch it early, catch it often. It's not just about risk, it's about misalignment. Because even if there is no privacy risk, you probably want a situation where the service does more or less than initially designed. You want to catch that deviation.
Perfect. There's another question from, which is when it comes to technical privacy review or privacy engineering assessment for AI, what are the top three things you would look for or you would test it against?
First thing I would test, do we have sort of a baseline? Here's what the data should look like. Here's what the services should look like. Here's what access management should look like. So test against that baseline and make sure that there is at least baseline compliance. We've talked a lot about compliance is not enough, but compliance is critical. You cannot shun compliance away, right? So building for compliance gives you a definitive, valid starting point. Just for what are the access patterns? Like what happens end to end with the data? Are we adding risk here? Are we subtracting risk here? So anytime you have an acceptable level of risk change up or down, you want to watch that. And the third thing you want to check for is, are there automated controls? Are there tamper-proof controls to make sure that stuff gets detected correctly, fixed correctly, and then verified correctly? You want to test for those three things. And then everything else is just noise. Because if you do these three things, you'll catch most of the issues. And then you will leave for the attorneys at the table to check the really big thorny legal issues.
Makes sense. So there's some more interesting question. One is about any comments on integration and use of third-party service providers and third-party application where the organization has less privacy engineering control. Yeah, probably I can just take this up, and I'm going to be a little biased, but yeah. Yeah, you can definitely utilize third-party tools to enforce some of these privacy engineering control. I mean, the main thing is to realize there won't be one tool that does it all. There's no silver bullet solution to privacy engineering or privacy in general. But like some of the things we talked about, visibility, governance, enablement, a tool like privacy code scanning, not just Privado, any privacy code scanning solution will take you closer to engineers without having for you to train a lot of engineers or hire or create a lot of privacy champions internally, right? So even with a lean privacy engineering team, you can start to create policies or guidance for engineers that are added in software development lifecycle automatically. You get a service map of what all features exist in the company and what data comes in, where data goes to external third parties. You get to make privacy as an API. Whenever an engineer writes a new code, they get instant, quick feedback on the privacy issues which exist there, right? So that would be probably a little biased answer. And the next one is for you, Nishant, which is there are plenty of tools and techniques for privacy engineering. I think the question talks about PAT specifically. And what they're asking is how do we know what is good for which use case? For example, why apply key anonymity on this database and not on that?
I think a lot of that comes down to judgment, but it also comes down to empirical data. So as an example, if you have a data set that is getting more and more information into it, if it's applying information about multiple users across multiple data sets, you want k-anonymity on there as much as possible. Because what happens in that data is identification risk is changing pretty continuously because the data set is being added to and queried from. So if you see that happening a lot, you want to apply k-anonymity as much as possible. And I would say not just k-anonymity, but L diversity as well, because that is not a constant. On the other hand, if you have a data store that is payment data, you probably don't apply anonymity because it's basically A, highly tokenized. You know what you're doing. But B, the data set cannot be misused too much because if you misuse payment data, somebody's going to notice. Like somebody's losing their job, right? Because if you take my credit card and use it to buy rugs in Turkey while you're shopping, I'm going to get a notification from my bank and somebody's going to notice something. So if you are looking at abnormal transactions taking place, looking at identification values being added, if you're looking for tables being linked, that is some situation to test for these. Because I feel like a lot of times people don't know what's going to happen to the data. So you should be very, very clear about what each data set is supposed to contain, what each service is supposed to look for. And anytime you see a deviation from that norm, you want to keep checking for anonymity as much as possible. Because remember, when you get to follow GDPR says right to be forgotten, what that basically means is the user's identification risk should stay very, very low as much as possible, right? And that risk has to be quantified to some degree. And anonymity has a baseline of 5, which is 5 records of the same type. If you see a deviation from that number, it gives you an idea that a risk is happening, right? So K anonymity is not just about checking for privacy risk, it's about making sure that you have an understanding of what the data can accomplish in the right hands and the wrong hands. I think having that mapping happen continuously means the legal team, the ends team, the product team, the ML team work together. And having and shaping that risk together is pretty critical because as privacy engineers, we can guide, we can apply these controls, but the context, the metadata comes from people not in this room. It comes from the people on the business side.
Perfect. I'm going to ask like a bonus question. We only have 2 minutes left, 2 minutes or 4 minutes left. Is Nishant, is there a story in your experience where privacy outcomes or the privacy work you were doing benefited someone which was not in privacy at all?
Absolutely. During my time at Netflix, we deleted a whole chunk of data that we didn't need, but we had collected preemptively for IP addresses. So when you launch a streaming service, some data makes it from your server, from your client to the server. The goal behind that is to customize your experience, entice you with good content, right? But that data was only collected for pre-consent, and that data was going all the way to the warehouse. And then when we deleted that data, we had better compliance. B, we were shown to be good privacy citizens, and C, we were able to restate the clusters a lot less frequently. Every Friday night, Netflix used to restate the clusters based on new data. If you have to delete X amount of data, that takes X time. If you have to now delete X by half X divided by 2 data, that takes X by 2 time, which means the platform team, the encryption team, the deletion team, the subscriber team, they all had access to more data faster. And we were storing a lot less data, spending a lot less money. And especially for Netflix at the time was a huge financial win. So good privacy means good efficiency and less expense, which is always the right thing to do, not just when the economy is down, but especially when the economy is up, because that is when you're collecting a lot of data and adding risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. I always feel, like, of course, we're very passionate about privacy and, there's the law, there's, of course, being a human right. But when we can link it to non privacy use cases, that's when everyone starts to come to privacy more proactively rather than you continuously finding things,
Yeah,
after the fact, right? So when privacy,
absolutely.
yeah, becomes like a product that you're measuring against KPIs that others are taking advantage of, like you've been saying, privacy becomes a platform, that's when everyone benefits. So
Yeah.
thanks for
It's like
sharing
you
that.
want to be in a situation where the person advocating for privacy tooling is not working in privacy because by that tooling makes their life easier. You want
Yeah.
them to sing your praises and you want privacy almost to move to the background. And I get that it sounds counterintuitive. We talk about privacy in the background at a privacy summit, but you want to get to a point where privacy is not the only person complaining about too much data, too much use cases.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Fernando, are we on time? Should we take more questions? What's the
Yeah,
status?
no, this is perfect timing. Thank you for going through our questions and answering thoughtfully, Nishant, as you always do.